Both of them ended up arriving in front of one of the rides that was akin to one of the spinny swing contraptions in most other well-beloved carnival and circuses. There was a moment of silence between them, her just avoiding his eyes. Just as he began to speak again, she quickly hushes him. After he goes silent, she lets out a sigh. For a moment, he got lost in her beauty, the way her lips puckered out in contemplation, her dazed faraway eyes glinting from the slight light that showed from the still active portion of the park. She began to speak. She went on to explain the reason she came to learn the act she chose in the circus. As a child, her relative used to be a professional trapezer in the old days of a traveling circus. She wanted to follow in her footsteps and become as great as her grandmother had been. Another reason for her coming there, and she emphasized this as the main reason for her choice, was for her wish to make it big and finally gain more revenue to be able to get away from her previous job. She was an underpaid waitress who basically lived from paycheck to paycheck and was always constantly barraged by sleazebags and selfish men who think that any attractive female serving their food and whose job revolves around serving them for a couple of hours is reason enough to make her job worse and more insufferable than it needed to be. He stared at her with furrowed brows and a deep concern for her. He was angered that men would stoop so low as to do that. He felt as though his mind expanded a bit, reminding him of something he'd only seen a long while ago, about a young-looking girl in a cheetah print fur coat that never really covered much in terms of the cold, stood underneath one of the streetlights in the city he rarely ever traveled to, on account the circus team always provided all that he really needed. But on that occasion that he did, he had seen this strangely winter-dressed girl standing in the cold with incredibly short shorts and high heels before a sleek white car drove up and picked her up and drove her off deeper into the city. Why was he thinking about that right now? He felt guilty for dozing off in the conversation on her. But when he refocused back on her, he was startled to see her glaring at him with surprising hatred. Did she know he wasn't paying attention? He was just about to apologize and admit to his mistake, but the next word she spat out at him made his heart stop and whirled still to a complete stop. He was the worst offender of all? His words died off in his throat, but even if he could speak, he wouldn't have been able to get a word in as she immediately goes on with rapid succession. No matter where she went, a creep would always be there, always either following her everywhere or professing emotions that never even existed in the first place. He wasn't funny at all, he wasn't charming, and even if people loved him, he was never even worth anything. The only thing he was good for was existing as something for people to laugh at, but never with. All she ever wanted was to be left alone. He clenched his eyes shut and slapped his hands over his ears, making her quiet and recoil away in fear. He didn't notice, however, and was just desperate to stop her words. His brain was already working on blotting out most everything she had just said to him. He was sorry. Oh God, he was so sorry. He was sorry. But suddenly, he was grabbed from behind and forcibly dragged from his feet and onto his back. 3 unfamiliar men in dark spy suits loomed over him with scary expressions on their faces. He was terrified. His mind was so scrambled, he only heard a couple of things from their interaction. Essentially, they figured he didn't want to hear or consider anything she had to say, and needed to be taught manners in a different and more convincing way. He attempted to scramble to his feet and make an attempt at escaping, but they were too strong as 3 people, and then they began to beat him. No matter how he struggled or tried to defend himself, their attacks never relented. Each and every strike left him seeing flashes of white, blinding red, and stunning black. Upon seeing that there wasn't much he could do, he just settled on turning over onto his stomach and curling up into a small ball, just hoping that the relentless agony and anguish would be over soon. After what felt like forever, through all the huffs and rough laughter, he suddenly heard her voice. It was frantic and strained. For a split second, he feared that she was about to be attacked as viciously as him. Almost by complete blind instinct, he swung his legs up in an arc and succeeded in kicking one guy in the face while landing back onto his hands and knees. The other 2 moved to incapacitate him again, but upon one grabbing his shoulders, he He clasped his calloused hands onto the guy's wrists and brought them both into a tumble and landed on the guy's chest heavily, effectively knocking the wind out of him. Finally on his feet again, he forgot the third guy in his rush to see that she was safe, and he was relieved to find that she was indeed unharmed and uncrowded, seeming scared out of her wits, but unharmed nonetheless. In his distracted moment of relief, the third guy was instantly kicking his legs out from under him and twisting his arm behind him once he was down on the ground again. He didn't hear the guy order her to turn the ride they were next to on due to his stunned and ringing ears. All he sees through bleary and bruised eyes is her running off towards the inactive carnival ride, and through his confused and unfocused mind, he was left wondering why she wasn't running the other way for safety. By this time, the other two men had recovered from their attack, and both helped in keeping him held down in constant pain. However, he didn't remain on the ground for long, as the men suddenly jerked him up, but by this time, and after the assault his body had just underwent, he was ready to just black out and didn't have the strength to even lift his legs. He felt himself get dragged along with the group towards the machine that was whirring to life. She moved aside from them and the machine and kept her distance. All as this was happening, he was losing his fight against staying conscious, and was just about to shut down completely until he was forcibly slapped in his face. One of them was keen on keeping him awake, and he nearly forgot what was happening to him. Why was he seeing swings in the sky? Why was he on the ground? Why were these people not letting him sleep? His confused delirium went on and on before he was suddenly dropped onto the ground with a harsh thud. He stares for a moment, and muffled voices began fading into his ears, which felt as though something warm was leaking from them. He wanted to wipe it away, that and what was pouring into his eyes too, but he couldn't seem to move his arm. God, why couldn't he just sleep? He became aware of the dull clang above his head, and let out a quick startled breath when the shirt was tugged up at the front, and he was dragged further away from the dim artificial light and into the darkness. The swings were blocking the light of the carnival in a strobe-like form. The carnival? Didn't he have a show to do? Pictures to take? He was shaken around a little bit, and his head weakly rolled off to the side and pounded in a painful way, almost as though he was having his skull bashed in by a sledgehammer from the inside. He wanted to laugh at the funny imagery of a mini him just swinging a sledgehammer around wildly inside his head, but all he managed to do was produce a gurgled cough. Was that blood he tasted? He blinked away the sudden black upon the curt voice that invaded his ears. The guy said something about her having a choice to make, and she said something with an anxious tone. The guy started demanding him to say her name, shaking him roughly for good measure to keep him focused and alert. Her name? She said he didn't know what it was, and that there was no reason to go through with it. Go through with what? Through bruised and bloodied eyes, he sees that she's just overall fearful and nervous. Was she scared for him? Were these guys threatening his life and hers? Did he have to say her name? Would that stop all of this? Would it protect her? He tried to search through his mind for whatever it could be. He had to have heard it somewhere at some time. Then, slowly, unfurling in his memory was a scene where he had first confessed his feelings to her, and she was first talking to her new peers. They had said her name, didn't they? And like a whisper, a name came to him, so quiet, in fact, that he would have never even realized its existence in the first place. Janine. He tried to speak up. However, he didn't realize that he'd already spoken this name aloud. Everyone had paused at this, and her expression remained astonishingly fearful for only several moments. But after that, her expression crumbled into a blank, unreadable one. She met her unwavering, dark, coal-black eyes to his bloodied and confused pair, and he finds he suddenly couldn't breathe anymore. There was no warmth to her eyes, and no beauty to her face, only a small woman in a dark black hoodie, and her face blanched pale with shadows outlining her face in a hauntingly gaunt manner. But like his damaged brain usually did, it jumped straight into blotting everything he had seen and experienced in a vain attempt at remembering her as she was underneath all those bright carnival lights. Happy, laughing, shy. And while he was doing this, he barely processed being lifted further from the ground and having his head draw closer and closer to the open panel of the ride, where the clicking and whirring gears turned. And once he was close enough, the teeth of the gears began closing in on his head before it caught his hair, sucked it in, and the rest followed after.